Hello and welcome back to Sunday Seminary Online. We are continuing with our study of the prophets of the Exile. My name is Brennan and I am guiding you here on behalf of First Presbyterian Church of Marietta. We are shifting in the middle of our time away from the book of Jeremiah, which we completed last week. We talked about the oracles against the nations in chapters 46 through 52 and the multiple endings of the book of Jeremiah. And we're moving to a very different kind of book, Ezekiel. So Ezekiel is also a prophet who wrote during the time of the exile. Like the book of Jeremiah, Ezekiel's work was kind of added to and combined with other things and extended beyond the time of his life into what we would think of as the Persian period or the time of the restoration after people come back. But still, we do think that a bulk of the book comes from the time of Ezekiel himself. It is very different in terms of Ezekiel's location, where he wrote this book and kind of his social location, what kind of person he was. We'll get into that a little bit. And we'll also talk a little bit about the structure of the book, that the book itself feels really different from the book of Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah and Ezekiel are both ancient prophetic works, so they don't read, like a modern, English novel or something. So they're going to feel really strange to us when we read them. But you'll notice if you read all the way through Ezekiel, after reading all the way through Jeremiah, you'll notice that Jeremiah feels kind of disjointed. It jumps from one topic to another. It feels kind of pulled apart, and there's very little structure to certain parts of it. It feels like it's written by someone who's been through a very traumatic experience. Ezekiel's world was a little bit less shaken up, and we'll get to why that is a little bit later. But the book itself is actually much more structured than the book of Jeremiah, and we'll get to why that is later too. But just to say, so you might if you started to read through Ezekiel after reading through Jeremiah, you might say, wow, there are some big differences. So that'll be part of what we try to get to today, is why there were these major differences. I'll just be looking at a couple verses of Ezekiel chapter 1. The very beginning, what we call the Superscription. So most prophetic books begin with what we call a superscription. It means a little editorial, kind of like a preface, that's added by an editor at a later date to try to help us understand the historical context in which the prophet lived and worked, and to give us a little bit of basic knowledge or information about who the prophet was. And we'll see that there's some really interesting, intriguing, even mysterious parts of Ezekiel's superscription in chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. So without further ado, let's go ahead and move on. Just to recap, remember that starting in around the year 745, the Assyrian Empire begins to expand into the area of the Levant, or the area of Palestine, or the area of kind of Israel and its environs, and conquers the northern kingdom of Israel in 722, lays siege to Jerusalem and destroys all the rest of Judah in 701 BC. And then Babylon ends up becoming the ascendant power in 612. Babylon conquers Assyria, and then it's just a very quick downward slide for Judah, which had remained. Remember, the northern kingdom falls in the year 722 BC. The southern kingdom falls in 587 with the destruction of Jerusalem. But remember, there's three different exiles. It's a slide into the exile in a way. Remember, the kings of the southern kingdom of Judah continue to make deals with Egypt, trying to, they're kind of hoping beyond hope that Egypt is going to help them defeat the Babylonian Empire, and they keep losing. So Babylon seems like it's really being terrible here, and it is in many ways. But they do actually give Jerusalem a few different tries, a few different chances. In 597, we have what's thought of as the first deportation. This is because King Jehoiakim rebels, and his son, King Jehoiachin, ends up taking over as the foreign army as the Babylonians are approaching. Those kings had tried to make an alliance with Egypt. They failed. They stopped kind of paying tribute to Babylon. Babylon took that as a revolt. So the Babylonian army shows up. There's a siege. Babylon does not destroy Jerusalem. Instead, they take the king Jehoiachin, They take him into exile. Remember, this is the end of the book of Kings, 2 Kings 25. They take Jehoiachin, they put him in exile, and then it's maybe 10 years later, right, that Zedekiah, who was later put on the throne as a kind of replacement king, also from the Davidic line, but someone who, I guess, promised to be subservient to the Babylonians. And Zedekiah rebels, and he is attacked, right? I mean, the Babylonian forces surround Jerusalem again, and the second time they don't. They're not so nice. They destroy the city walls. They destroy the city itself. They destroy the temple, and they take more people into exile. Then that first deportation in 597, they didn't take a whole lot of people, it seems. The numbers vary throughout different witnesses from the Bible, but probably a few thousand people. And this would have been a significant percentage of the population of Judah, by the way. I mean, a few thousand people still would have been a lot. I mean, Jerusalem wouldn't have been larger than 30,000 people or so at its height, sometime around the time of its destruction. So a few thousand people would have been really noticeable. It could have even been a few hundred people. It's hard to know. But in any event, so some people are taken into exile. Those people would have been elites, like the king Jehoiachin and his entourage and other members of the royal family, but also some artisans or people who had talents or skills that the Babylonians might have wanted. People who would have been taken to work in the royal household. Those kind of folks would have been kind of deported. And perhaps the high priest or the members of the high priest's family, although this isn't reported in the biblical text or whatever, but we can just assume that some of the most powerful people in Judah and in Jerusalem in particular would have been taken into exile as a kind of a punishment, but also in a way to kind of behead what the Babylonians assumed was the kind of the rebellious members of the Judahite elite. So like to try to like take out the people who had caused the exile in a way. Now, those people who were taken into exile were taken to Babylon. Remember Jeremiah's letter to the exiles, Jeremiah chapter 29, and he writes and tells them, hey, things are going to be okay for you, actually. Jeremiah writes that to the first members of the deportation. He says, you're going to be there a long time. It's not going to be 1 year, 2 years, or 5 years. It's going to be like 50 years, 70 years. It's going to be a long, long time, and so it ends up being 40-some years, right? But this Jeremiah is trying to let them know you need to settle down, you need to work hard, you need to start a life there, build homes, have kids, and we know that this was possible. So just to say that these three different deportations, I'm going to shrink myself a little bit here. These three different deportations really had three different groups of people who were targeted by them, and in a way had different results. There were different outcomes for them. So the first Babylonian siege, again, these are the elites, right? So Jehoiachin gets replaced with Zedekiah. This is 597 BC. There's no destruction to the temple. There's no destruction to the city walls. Jerusalem still functions as a real city. But those people who are taken in exile, they kind of think of themselves as the elite who have been in a way spared the destruction of Jerusalem, because Jerusalem gets destroyed, and there's a grisly scene in 587, 586, depending on how you date that. But all to say that the destruction of Jerusalem is a horrific thing. And in a way, that first wave of exiles, they kind of think they were spared it, or that and there's a little bit of kind of a, I don't know, they assume that they were spared it in a way because maybe they didn't deserve to go through the worst of it. So, we're going to see some of that in Ezekiel, which is an interesting question, right? That second wave, they go through the horrors of the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. They suffer a lot. That third wave in 582, and by the way, that second wave would have included a wider swath of the population. Not everyone. There's a myth of the evacuation of the land. Sometimes you'll see in biblical texts, like there was no one left in the land and so on. We know that's not true. Lamentations is a book written by people who were left in the land. People who were living in Judah after the wake of the destruction. We read about these people in Jeremiah as well. Remember, there's people who come to lament at the place where the temple used to be. We know that there was a governor, Gedaliah, who was related to the family of Shaphan, a major family. and he was left behind by the Babylonians to be a governor. He was killed by members of the Davidic family, kind of distant relatives of the Davidic royal family, and they tried to start another government, and they ran away as well. So all to say, like, we know that there's even like some elites that are left behind even after the second deportation, but there's probably not very many. The Babylonians left, though, people who were farmers, left people behind who could take care of the land. And the reason the Babylonians do this is because they don't want an empty land. They want a land that's producing stuff that they can take, right? The Babylonians own this territory. The other thing to know is that the exiles weren't taken away to be put in jail or something like that, or like to be kept in kind of locked cages or something. Prison didn't really exist in the ancient world. It sort of did. You can keep people kind of under lock and key if they were like political prisoners and things like this. If you were holding someone to try to like interrogate them to get information, you might put them in something like a jail cell or dungeon kind of thing. But the large portions of the population were not imprisoned, and the reason is you can't afford it. I mean, you put someone in prison, you got to feed them, right? I mean, there's not a lot of extra food in the ancient world. So you had to have people work. So these Judahites were not like imprisoned in the exile. They were not put in camps or anything like that. The point is that they were settled in these towns so that they could farm and so that they can make stuff, do stuff that was good for the economy. And they were in fact settled. These people who were deported were settled in different places around Mesopotamia that had been depopulated during the war between Assyria and Babylon over control of Mesopotamia. So remember, Assyria is in control of Mesopotamia and of the Levant, the area around Israel and Judah, from 745, remember Tiglath-Pileser III, 745 or so, until about 612. And between about 650 and 612, there's a struggle that Babylon begins to rise. There's basically a war that takes place between the Babylonians and the Assyrians. Babylonians end up winning. This is how Nebuchadnezzar becomes kind of, emperor of that region of the world. But the point being that there's whole cities that get demolished in Mesopotamia as a result of this war. And Babylon wants them to be repopulated, and when they want those farmlands to be opened up again. So if you think about Mesopotamia, there's two big rivers, right? The Tigris and the Euphrates River, and there's flat land that needs to be irrigated. There's the possibility when you have irrigation farming or wet farming, there's a potential for like huge yields, but this requires a lot of labor. So you need a lot of people working on these farms, and if a lot of people have died because of a conflict, then they're going to deport people from their homelands and resettle them and make them work and farm and run these areas. So a lot of these people who are resettled, like Ezekiel, right, they were resettled in order to work. So later on when they're sent home, they haven't been sent home from jail or something. They're being sent home from jobs and occupations and land that they've, Jeremiah's letter was legitimate in the sense that it actually named things that were possible for them to do, right? I mean, make homes, settle down, have gardens, right? I mean, they did all those things. They started businesses. I'll show you examples of some of that in just a moment. So that's why there's some tension even in coming back home. But all to say that when these different communities, we have some different books that reflect these different communities. And it's important for us in studying the book of Ezekiel to recognize that Ezekiel is part of that first Babylonian deportation, part of the first Babylonian siege in 597. Ezekiel is taken in 597, and his book begins in the year 593. So at least we think. But so this, in the year 593, like Ezekiel's already in exile. He's already been resettled. He's already started a new life there. We're 4 years or so into this experience of exile. But it's, remember, only the first exile. So the temple still stands. Jerusalem still stands. The walls of Jerusalem still stand. There's still a king of Judah in Jerusalem, Zedekiah. Babylon is dominant, but Babylon has not yet crushed them. And there's relatively few Jews who've been resettled so far. And when we think of it that way, the book of Ezekiel then begins to make a lot more sense. If you don't have that in mind, Ezekiel can be really tricky to try to figure out what's happening. Just to show you a little map here of where the Jewish exiles go. In this map of the ancient Near East, you can see Egypt over here. Above and to the east, Babylonia. Assyria is on top there. You can see Assyria and Babylon is in the north of Mesopotamia. Babylonia is in the south of Mesopotamia. You can see those two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, that form Mesopotamia, or the Greek word for the land between the two rivers. And you can see to the west of that the area of the Levant, so Judah, Moab, Edom, Ammon, and so on. And you can see that the Jews who were taken in the exile were sent north along the seaboard, because you can't go through the desert. We'll get to that with Isaiah chapter 40 when we talk about second Isaiah. But in any event, you go up the seaboard because there's water there, and then you go down the Euphrates River again because there's water there, and you don't go through the middle of the desert. But when they're settled, some of them are settled in the city of Babylon, but probably a few of them, they were actually settled in other areas, and really outside the Babylonian cities. The Babylonians would found little towns, and they would group people by their ethnic groups. So the Jews would get a little town outside of a city that needed to be repopulated in order to work the farmlands in that area. One of these cities is Nippur. So you can see on the map there, you see Borsippa. You can see Babylonia, the big Babylonia. Above that, north of that just a little bit, you can see Sippar, Kutath, Babylon, and then Borsippa. And then to the east of that a little bit, Nippur. So the south of Borsippa and east of Babylon, the city of Babylon, in the city of Nippur, or outside the city of Nippur, we know that there were Jews who were resettled there, in part because we have information about them, archaeological information. There are tablets that have been dug up that have financial records of some of these Jewish families, and we have even some writings from some of these Jewish families. I mean, there's some amazing stuff. And from this, we know that they owned land. Women in these families owned land and ran some businesses and things. So this is to say, women oftentimes have, in the ancient world, the records that we have show us that women actually had more freedoms and more financial freedoms and economic liberty than sometimes we imagine that they had in the ancient world, based on literary texts that we have. But one of these archives, the Marashu family archives, it's basically a banking family, a business family that lends a lot of money and so on. And we can see that we can see lots of information of Jews kind of borrowing things or renting oxen and things like this to help plow their fields and so on. So we have lots of information about the lives, the day-to-day lives of these folks. What we don't have is a lot of information about what they believed or what they did, or we just kind of have their financial records. We also in the last decade or so, there's a bunch of tablets that have been dug up and then decoded and translated that come from the town of Al Yehudu, which is outside of Nippur. Al Yehudu was you can think of it as like a suburb that was founded during this resettlement of during the time of the exile. And again, little local pockets of different ethnicities that were being deported from different places to the Babylonian region to repopulate it after the wars. They were resettled in kind of ethnic enclaves. So you think about like, if you go to Chicago or something, you'll have different kind of like pockets of the city, like, Ukrainetown and stuff like that, that with these little kind of different ethnic populations. Or you go to, Chinatown in Washington, D.C. or something like that, it's or New York City, Little Italy or something. And you've got these little ethnic kind of enclaves where people are resettled and then can start a life. And oftentimes, they change over periods of time, right? But this is what Al Yehudu is. Yehudu would mean basically Jew. So this is like saying this is Jewish town or Jewtown. This is where this comes from. So this is a tablet, one of these tablets from Al Yehudu, and it's an economic document. But this is all written in cuneiform. See those wedges? That's like Babylonian, basically, right? So that's the script for the Babylonian language. So people were writing these economic documents in Babylonian, but on the side of it, you can see that's actually that's Paleo-Hebrew. That's a kind of an old form of Hebrew language, and that says Shalomia. It's a name of someone. Someone signed their name on the document, so you can see that these people could write both in Babylonian. Or cuneiform is the script, like the actual kind of writing script. The language we might say is Akkadian, but you can just say Babylonian. But so they're writing in the Babylonian language in the cuneiform script. But you can see that they also sign it in Hebrew in a Paleo-Hebrew script, which is basically the Phoenician script. This is how ancient Phoenicians would write. the ancient Hebrew people stole the Phoenician alphabet. This looks different than what you might think of as today as Hebrew letters. That's because what people currently use for Hebrew letters and what, say, the state of Israel uses to write, Hebrew in, or even your local synagogue, if you see like the name of the synagogue written in Hebrew, it won't look like this. It'll use Aramaic letters, the Aramaic square script, the one that's got kind of more angles. It's like right angles to it. So all to say, what we're looking at here is a bilingual document showing that Jews were, in a way, accommodating to their local environment, but also not. They were remaining who they were. They were keeping their names, their particular Yahwistic names, or names that resonated with them from their own practice and their own culture, and they were passing on their own language, to different generations. So this is fascinating for us, archaeological evidence for us to see, and to kind of get a sense for what it would have been like for, say, Ezekiel, right? Somebody living in Al Yehudu, this area outside of Nippur. And trying to get a sense for what day-to-day life would have been like. And, Ezekiel doesn't talk about like being stuck in prison or something like this. I mean, he talks about walking around by a canal, the Kibar River, which is a canal that goes through the city, outside the city of Nippur. I've got a map to show you in just a moment. But it's just neat to see, as well, that, he seems to be able to kind of meet with other Jews whenever he wants. They sit down to pray together, to talk together, to reason together. And these informal sessions of sitting down to reason and think and pray together, this is probably the beginning of what we call the synagogue. Synagogue's a Greek word, really, which means like to kind of meet together. But what it's describing is this Jewish practice, at least within a Jewish context. It's describing this Jewish practice of like kind of meeting together to pray and sit and think and read together. What's fascinating is that, like, a synagogue isn't a priestly service. It's not a sacrificial service, right? Like you think about at the temple. So that it comes about when the temple's destroyed. When the temple is destroyed, what do you do? How do you continue your lineage? How do you continue? So we'll get back to this in a minute, but it's just some questions for us to think about. So again, this area Nippur, I'm going to show you. You can see that kind of the trail ends there, at least for some of these Jewish communities. Some of them were settled south of Borsippa. This is an artist's recreation of Nippur based on archaeological evidence. I said this before, but I'll say it again. I think this is an amazing just little bit of evidence or fact, that kind of helps resituate us within the ancient world, that when Ezekiel goes through the doors of Nippur, when Ezekiel sees this city, right, he's laying eyes on something that was founded sometime around the year 3500 BC, before there was writing, before writing was invented. This city was settled. This is the Sumerians originally settled this city. Was taken over by Babylonians later, but this is a very, very ancient city, and it's about the year 597 when Ezekiel goes through the doors of Nippur. So it's important for us to realize that we are closer in time to Ezekiel walking through the doors of Nippur than Ezekiel was at his time to the founding of Nippur. So this is to say, when Ezekiel and Israel had only been around for less than 500 years, right, as a kingdom. The kingdom of Israel begins sometime around the year 1000 BC. It's done by 587. So less than 500 years, right, for Israel to be a people, a kingdom. And this city had been around at that moment in time for more than 3,000 years. Amazing, right? I mean, Israel is a blip on the radar of a rich and deep history, right? Cultural history of the ancient Near East. And Ezekiel knew this, right? This is a formative moment for ancient Judaism. But it's amazing to me that the Jews that arrived here didn't say, okay, well, this larger kingdom has conquered us. They've taken us. We're going to assimilate, right? We're going to take on their language. We're going to take on their culture. We're going to stay here, to take their names, worship their gods. I mean, we know that a lot of people ended up doing this, but there was something about this. The Jews really create what we would think of as the diaspora here. The diaspora being a situation where you're not just kind of like, you're not just taken away from someplace and then you're just waiting to get back. I mean, you kind of are able to exist and pass on your culture in a place that's not your home without being crushed by the people around whom you're trying to survive, right? I mean, the majority cultures usually suppress, dominate, crush minority cultures that live within them. This is just the way that human civilizations have operated since the beginning, since ancient Sumer, that we know of. But all to say that the Jews developed this way of passing on their culture and language and so on, and keeping it alive. And this is a miracle. I mean, there's a lot of other ways to say it, but I think this is an example of how God works. So. All to say that that Ezekiel is immersed within this culture of ancient Babylon, but he's also living within a pocket of other Jews, and they're trying to figure out what does it mean to be Jewish now here, right? Is God with us? Is Yahweh with us? If Yahweh's with us, how? And why, right? Is Yahweh still with us? Did Yahweh reject us forever? What do we do about sacrifices? What do we do about prayer and worship? The temple was the way we related to God, right? All that stuff is now kind of on the table. Here's a little ancient map of Nippur, by the way. This is from the ancient Babylonian period. You can see there's a little cuneiform, little like wedge-shaped writing in different places, noting different buildings, the temple, the palace, and so on. And you can see these little canals, so the Euphrates River had canals that went off of it that then had irrigation networks that came off of it and fed the farmland around. And the Kibar was one of these irrigation canals. I mean, it wasn't an irrigation canal. It was a branch that came off of the Euphrates that was diverted, was made to come through this city of Nippur that then was used to irrigate the irrigation canals came off of the Kibar Canal that went through the city of Nippur. And so that's this kind of line that you see there. And it's labeled the Kibar Canal. Today, if you were able to go to Nippur, which you probably can't go today, it's in Iraq, difficult to get to at this moment in time, although I hope sometime in our lifetimes it's possible and easy to go. But here we see what's left of Nippur. These are some of the images from the archaeological excavation. This is the temple site, and you can see there's little kind of like cells where some of the priests would have lived and so on. And that brings me to talking about Ezekiel himself, because Ezekiel was a priest. Now, he wasn't a priest of Nippur, of any of the gods or goddesses that were worshipped in Nippur, but he was of the priestly families of Judah that were resettled in Nippur. So here's what we know about Ezekiel. We know some incidental things. We know he was married and so on, because that pops up later in the text, although not a lot of space or information is given to his wife. But that is to say that there's other biographical information later on, but this is a chunk of it right here, starting in chapter 1, verse 1. This is what we'll look at today. Chapter 1 of Ezekiel, verse 1. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the river Kibar. Now, this is really important here because he said, as I. If you look at the other superscriptions, they seem to be written by other people. About the prophet Amos and so on. You look at the superscriptions for these other prophetic books, they're clearly written by editorial hands. This one might be too, but this person's claiming to be speaking in Ezekiel's name, which is really interesting. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the river Kibar, the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. And then it changes a bit, and it says, on the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, the son of Buzi. Now it doesn't say I here, right? It says Ezekiel. So we have this kind of like interesting combination superscription here where there's an I part and then there's a Ezekiel in the third person part. The word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Kibar, and the hand of the Lord was on him there. So this is what we're going to look at. There's a lot of information in here, a lot of interesting things. It might not sound interesting, but in the 30th year, in the 4th month, and the 5th day of the month, if you look at another superscription from another prophetic book, if you just look back at, say, Jeremiah, chapter 1, the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, this is just Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 1, the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anatot in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of King Josiah, son of Ammon of Judah, the 30th year of his reign. It came also in the days of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah, until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. If you look throughout all the prophetic books, they are recorded according to the years of the king, right? So this king to the year of this king to the year of that king. I mean, if you just kind of look through the minor prophets, you'll see this. So like Amos chapter 1, right? The words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of King Uzziah of Judah and the days of King Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel. You have the kings kind of act as measuring sticks, right, for time. They don't have like a year one sort of thing, right? I mean, they measure times by like when this king came to power and how long this king reigned, and then then the 5th year of this king's reign, and so on. But you'll notice in Ezekiel that the one king that's mentioned is the exile of King Jehoiachin. He's not king anymore, really, and it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin. That's not really the marker of time. But then what's this 30th year thing? And the 30th year of what? That can't be the 30th year of the exile. That would have been like near the end of the exile. 30th year from what king? I mean, King Jehoiachin is 5th year of exile. I mean, we're doing 30 years after some other king, Nebuchadnezzar or something like that. I mean, that doesn't make any sense either. I mean, so 30th year doesn't make any sense. For measuring by kings of Babylon, kings of Judah, kings of Israel. Nothing makes sense with 30th year. 30th year, 4th month, and the 5th day of the month. He's getting super specific here. No other prophet measures by like the days of the month except for Haggai. That one we'll talk about when we talk about the Persian period later on in the Restoration. But this is like way too specific here. And also like what month, what day of the month, 30th year of what? And some scholars have mentioned something that is the only way that I can make sense of it. The 30th year of what? Of Ezekiel's life. The 30th year since Ezekiel was born, in his 30th year, on the 4th month on the 5th day of the month. So it's not Ezekiel's birthday, but it's like kind of near Ezekiel's 30th birthday. Now, why would that matter? Well, it might matter because we see that the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi, in verse 3, priest Ezekiel, he's a priest. Remember, Jeremiah was a priest, but he was a weird kind of priest. He was a priest from descended from a line of priests who were exiled a long time ago, right? Which may have been part of why Jeremiah doesn't like the temple so much, because his great-great-great-great-granddad was exiled from the temple. And it also might be why he didn't like the Davidic kings, because Solomon's the one who kicked out his great-great-great-great-grandfather from being the head chief priest, right? So the high priest, we don't know exactly who was high priest at this time. It's a bit murky here. We don't have a lot of records to go on, but it's possible that the 30th year would have been really important because that's the year that a priest gets ordained in ancient Israel. Priests, sort of could serve in certain roles, and they weren't priests yet, but people from priestly families who were considered fit to serve could work and kind of apprentice as priests for a long time. But when they turned 30, they could get ordained. When they turned 50, they got deordained and they retired. And they would continue to work in other capacities, but they just wouldn't be a temple priest. That is, working at the altar and so on with sacrifices. So the 30th year, Ezekiel's 30th birthday, this is kind of like Ezekiel's ordination service, except it can't happen. He didn't get ordained because he's in exile. And to get ordained, I mean, if you want to read about ordination, Leviticus chapters 8 through 10 are all about ordination ceremonies, and you got to have all this stuff. You got to have good anointing oil. You got to have implements, sacred and holy things. You got to be in the space of the temple. You got to have the right kind of vestments, and everything has to be purified in the temple space, in the holy space. Well, the temple is way off in Jerusalem, and it's still standing at this point in time. Remember, the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's exile, the temple's still standing. This is 593 BC. So 593 BC, the temple hasn't fallen yet, but Ezekiel's nowhere near it. How can he be ordained in the middle of Babylon? So this is the kind of crucial thing. How do we operate? How do we function in exile? Has God abandoned us? Do we have to abandon sacrifice and prayer? Do we have to abandon... and they don't sacrifice, it seems. So then if sacrifice is atoning for us, if Ezekiel's a priest, he takes very seriously, if he's from a priestly family, right, he takes very seriously the idea that to have God's presence be near, we need to be holy. We need to have a holy space that's set aside for God. We need to have regulations about this holy space. The priests and priestly people are really serious about this stuff. Now, I'll get more into this next time, but all to say that the priestly world, the kind of symbolic world of ancient priests, revolves around the ideas of holiness and of purity. Holiness is like God's presence. God is holiness. It's God's kind of think of it as like a nuclear power plant that just operates, kind of flows, power flows out of God. It's dangerous to humans because we're not built to withstand nuclear radiation, right? I mean, God, think of how powerful God is, that God created nuclear radiation, right? God created the stars. God created this entire universe and all the energy in it, and that's like a nothing to God, right? So God is beyond all possible power. We are not built to withstand that kind of, humans can't be in proximity to that kind of power, that kind of holiness without dying. It's not because God hates us. It's because we're not built to stand next to a star either. And God's bigger and stronger and more powerful and more glorious than a star. So we got no chance standing near God, right? So if you look at the book of Exodus, you can see this in action. Now, this is the part of the book of Exodus that no one reads, or I shouldn't say no one, but most people don't read. Exodus chapters 1 through 15 are the fun part that everyone knows about, the plagues, the crossing of the sea, and then 16 through 19 is them journeying through the wilderness, some exciting and interesting stories there. Chapters 20 through 24, 23 really, up to 24, that's the Mount Sinai, which is exciting in its own right, and there's a lot going on there. And then chapter 25, all the way to the end, chapter 40 of Exodus. This is the part that very few people read, in part because it seems kind of boring. It's about the building of the tabernacle so that they can travel in the wilderness, and stuff like that goes in the tabernacle, like the lampstand, the menorah, or the lampstand, creating the Ark of the Covenant, and things like this. We're going to get back to the Ark of the Covenant next time. But so why is half the book of Exodus about liberation and then half the book of Exodus about interior decorating, right? Building like curtains and stuff. Well, it's because if you look at chapter 25, where things pivot here, and this is kind of a very priestly way of thinking about the world. God says, I want to make some stuff, like a building that can move around, right? A mobile tabernacle, a mobile temple, because you're going to be moving through the wilderness for a while here. In verse 8 of chapter 25, and have them make me a sanctuary, a special place, so that I may dwell among them. I'm going to show you this pattern for all this stuff so that you can build it so that I can dwell among you. And the basic idea of the priestly world is that we humans can't have God living in the midst of us without basically a nuclear explosion happening every second. And we won't survive that. So to have God dwell with us, we have to have some kind of mediation. So the priests, think of them as like the nuclear power plant operators. They have you read Leviticus, it seems a little anal retentive, right? But they got this kind of operating manual, and they follow it very closely because they're trying to protect everyone, right? They're trying to protect people from God's presence so that you can be near God, but also so that you don't get destroyed being near God. But there's a couple other really important things here, which is one, that the key to this is the altar, because the sins of the people end up, and the impurities of the people, the moral impurities and ritual impurities, like touching a dead body and coming into the temple and things like this. This kind of brings dirt into God's house. It's not dirt you can see with your eyes, but it's like spiritual dirt. And that spiritual dirt, hatred and slander and stealing from people and murder, even lust and coveting, right? All that stuff that's in our hearts, that's like where we use other people for our own purposes, where we hurt them, where we plan to take advantage of them. All that stuff ends up kind of glomming on to the altar. The altar is kind of like those horns of the altar. It's got 4 horns or 4 points coming out of it. And those are kind of like lightning rods that attract sin. Now, why would God want to attract sin into God's house? So you can take care of it, so you can clean it up. Because if the land gets filled, and the temple especially gets filled with kind of sins and impurities, God's going to leave, because God doesn't like living in a messy house. Imagine you're living in a house with someone else. Someone moves into your house, and that person begins to just leave trash everywhere. And you say, please clean up your trash, please clean up your trash. After a while, it becomes a health hazard, and you're just going to leave. You might leave the house if or you might kick them out, right? But one of you has to go if someone else is making it dangerous for you to live there. So think about it like that. The people's sins are polluting God's house. And the altar exists because in the ancient world, this is kind of like a broader idea. I mean, as far back as we can find ancient human remains, we can find, and especially ancient human remains that have some kind of culture that we can see around it. So like the cave paintings in Lascaux, these 40,000-year-old human remains, we find sacrificed bones, we find altars. Humans from time immemorial have believed that there is something special or sacred in blood, in animal blood especially, that cleans something, that does something. And in ancient Israel, the idea was, this is an idea that was shared by most people from the ancient world, was that animal blood does something. Now, whether you believe that animal blood does this thing or not, this was like a way that God could communicate with the people of ancient Israel, right? They got it. That is, they understood that they were claiming responsibility for their own sins. They bring a lamb to the altar, they put their hand on it, they say, this is mine, I claim responsibility for the things that I've done that sinned against God and against my neighbor. This is a way for making up for it. The priest takes the blood of the animal and washes the horns of the altar, that scrubs the horns of the altar, and then kind of dashes the blood all around the base of the altar to clean up the mess. Now, it's dirty to us to have blood everywhere, right? But it's not about physical dirt or disease or anything. It's about the priests in the ancient world were thinking about spiritual cleanliness. And after the priest manipulates the blood, then the priest would cook the food. Like the altar had a big grate on it with hot coals on it, and so you put the animal on the grate and you cook it, and then you have a feast. You would eat the people you offended. You would invite them, and they would eat with you, and your family would eat, and the priests and their families would eat, and you'd have a reconciliation meal. So all to say that the priests, think of this system as, in a way, making it possible for humans and God to live together. You have to have all this system going to have ordinations. So if you're in Babylon and you're separated from that space, that holy altar, you can't have ordinations. You can't have the reconciliation that you're used to. You can't have the communication between you and God, right? All those psalms that say, I love to be in your temple courts. That's because they thought that mediated God's presence to them. What if you can't get to the temple courts, or after the destruction? What about if the temple's gone? Where is God? What happened? How did God go? Did God go somewhere? Now, we're going to see that next week that Ezekiel comes up with some answers to this that are kind of different than Jeremiah. Not kind of. They are. They're different than Jeremiah. Ezekiel's ministering to a different community than Jeremiah was. Remember, Jeremiah was initially ministering to the peoples who had remained. And he was sending letters abroad. He was talking to a lot of different people, but primarily he's ministering to the people who remained in the land. Ezekiel's ministering to a different group, the people who had gone, who had been taken in the first deportation, and who are struggling with these. Personally, I don't have any proof for this, but it just seems there's different points of Ezekiel where, and we'll see this as we go through the book, where the elders of the community who have been taken into exile are sitting at his feet and asking him questions, and he's basically making up new rules for them, new ways of life, okay, so we don't have a temple. What do we do now? And he's the one that they're asking, and he's giving answers. Maybe he's just a prophet or something. Maybe he's this priest who's like, the ordination is a big deal, and the elders of the community who have been taken into exile, like the cream of the crop of the royal family and of the priestly families and so on, they're all sitting at his feet, apparently, in his house, asking him questions, and he's giving answers. I think Ezekiel probably was the person in line to be the high priest. And so on the day of his ordination, he's gone. He's not he can't be ordained. So what we see in chapters 1 through 3, that vision of the wheels within wheels, which we're going to get to next time, this has something to do with Ezekiel's ordination. It's kind of it's trying to tell him something about God's presence and about Ezekiel's mission that is going to look really different for him. So just to remind us, these questions that we're left with, this right here is an image that's from the Arch of Titus. This is from made in the year 70 AD. So after the time of Jesus, but it depicts something that's a lot like what happens during the time of Ezekiel. That is, this is the Roman army breaking in and taking stuff from the temple. They were looking for a temple statue, like a statue of a god, and the closest they could find to that was that big lampstand, the menorah, that we can read about in Exodus 25. So they put that on their statue that they put back in Rome, the Arch of Titus. They carved it to celebrate defeating Judea in 70 AD. And destroying Jerusalem again, destroying the temple again. And so here the Roman armies depict them carrying the menorah out, which they think is like a tree god or something like that. The menorah was supposed to be a tree, right? But all the same. these questions that were brought up in the destruction of the temple were resonating through Ezekiel's life. And the fact that there's a Judaism and a Christianity that exist after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, I think that all goes back to the fact that these answers were kind of cooked up already in the time of Ezekiel and Jeremiah. How do we continue as a people without a homeland, without a temple? So in any event, those questions, why would God let this happen? What actually did happen? Where was God? When will we return? When will God return? When will God be our God again? Did God ever stop being our God? Right? Who are we now? Are we still Judeans? We don't live in Judea anymore. Are we still Yahwists? Where is Yahweh now? Right? Did our God die? Did our God get beaten by Marduk, the god of Babylon? How will we ordain people? How will we pray to God? How will we sing to God? How will we, ordain new priests? How will we sacrifice animals and atone for our sins? Think of any ritual thing. How will we purify someone after, some sort of incident? All of those questions are just left completely wide open. But Ezekiel begins to give us another answer, and it's an amazing answer. And we'll have to wait on getting into that next week when we talk about Ezekiel chapters 1 through 3. See you then. Peace.